Come over. Good evening, everyone. How are you? My name is Siobhan Boyd-Nelson. It is such a privilege and a pleasure to be before you this evening. I want to thank Ben for the invitation. I want to thank you for having me and allowing me to be in front of you this evening. Our scripture reading comes from Luke 16, specifically Luke the 16th chapter, verses 10 through 13 and verse 18. Whoever is faithful in a very little is faithful also in much, and whoever is dishonest in a very little is dishonest also in much. If then you, who have not been faithful with the dishonest wealth, who will entrust you to the true riches? And if you have not been faithful with what belongs to another, who will give you what is your own? No slave can serve two masters, for a slave will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. Anyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery. Sorry, I skipped down to verse 18. Anyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery, and whoever marries a woman divorced from her husband commits adultery. This is the word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
So I want to give you a little bit of background on who I am before I speak to you, and you're going to learn a little bit more about me during the message this evening. But whenever I speak in front of folks, I always want you to know from whom the message is being delivered. Context is important, and I think it will be important in this regard. So when I introduce myself, I identify as a queer lesbian who is Black and of Christian faith, who is also a mother, who is a leader, and who is trying their best to have a true relationship with my God, with specifically the God whom I consider my creator. And so I come before you today not as someone who has been formally trained to be here. I am not someone who has been to seminary, who has not been formally trained in the Bible. Instead, I come to you after prayerful contemplation. I come to you after having listened to God about some things that I perhaps did not want to hear God say, because I don't know about you, but that pretty much defines my relationship with God, and that's how I know it is a real relationship with God. I am often saying things to God that I would not say in front of anyone else. I would not say to anyone else. And God is often speaking back to me in a way that no one else could, right? In other words, God knows how to push my buttons. And I think that that is a beautiful, beautiful thing. So the passage that I read and from which I am speaking today came about because Ben and I host a podcast as part of Love Boldly. It's called Coming Out Christian. And we had a guest on the podcast, and that guest has his own podcast and his own social media things. And one of the things that he does is called Bible in a Minute. And what he asks folks to do is simply to break down a single chapter of the Bible in 60 seconds. And then I believe it is once a week he posts a chapter of the Bible. And that's how you're getting through the Bible. 1 minute at a time, one chapter at a time. If that isn't genius, I don't know what is. I think it's a beautiful ministry. And so I volunteered and said, absolutely, give me a chapter. In fact, don't just give me one, give me two. And so the first chapter that he gave me was Luke 16. And he said, hey, if you could get this back to me around the same time that I was going to be preaching this sermon that I had talked to Ben about being here. And I said, well, great. Who doesn't love a twofer? I know I do. And so I thought, here it is. I'm going to do Luke 16. I'm going to know everything about Luke 16. It's a gospel. It can't be that hard. So I'm thinking, no problem. And then I read it. And then I read it again. Ooh, I read a commentary. And then I read another commentary. And through all of this, I'm thinking, what have I gotten myself into? And so before we dig into the message, I want to go to the Lord in prayer, if you will join me. Precious Lord, dearest Creator, who has brought us together this evening in this place for a message from you. And Lord, I pray that our ears are open, but not only our ears, Lord, our hearts. I pray that we are tuned in, to our relationship with you, our personal relationship with you, as we listen to this message, that you speak individually to each person here and each person watching or listening, that specific message that you have for them. Because Lord, you are so great. We know that you can take words and you can have a different meaning for each person in this room that is going to be meaningful for them in their lives, and that this can be a blessing for them. And Lord, I pray that nothing but blessing will be poured out upon these heads this evening. In your precious name, amen. So if you know anything about Luke 16, you'll know it's about money. And I thought, ugh, do not want to talk about money, y'all. That is not a fun topic for me to talk about. And that might seem strange if you know anything about me, but I really did not want to write a sermon about money. Money is not something I want to talk about or think about unless I'm fundraising as the president of 2 boards. Fundraising is a lot of what I do. In fact, I had a career for almost 15 years as a fundraiser, but we'll get that into a bit. That's a whole different conversation with money. It's much different than this one today. But if you would ask my wife, also known as the CFO of my marriage, money is not my strong suit. And I know this, which is why Shay is my CFO. So if money is not my strong suit, why then would God ask me to deliver this message today? And I think it has to start with the fact that I have a funny relationship with money and I need to work on it, right? God often will speak to me and say, oh, no, by the way, that word was for you too. So to explain my funny relationship with money, let me take you back to the late 20th century. I'm speaking of the 1980s and 90s. And a lower middle class Black parents were doing their best to raise a little Black girl here in Columbus who wouldn't fall prey to sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And they did a pretty good job, if I may say so myself, but their approach to money might have been a little bit off. You see, my parents decided that the way to keep me away from drugs specifically was to keep me away from money to buy drugs. I was never given an allowance. I was not paid for chores or for grades. Money didn't become a gift until I was over 18, and I was not allowed to work until I finished high school. If I needed something, I had to ask for it. If I needed the thing, if I wanted money, I had to specifically ask for it. Now, that's not to say I didn't do the chores, that I didn't make good grades or even work. I started volunteering at a very young age, around 12, and I donated my time all over the city, COSI, the library, Columbus Recreation and Parks. But what I have come to realize in all of that and in that relationship with money that my parents kind of put in me as that foundation was that I was raised to not have a direct relationship with money. I was raised for someone else to be my conduit in my relationship with money. I was always to be one step removed from it. And then you're going to couple this with an upbringing of 12 years of private Christian school. And so the love of money is the root of all evil. I know that, yes. And so you have a young woman who will simply avoid money. And it's almost the opposite of a hustler spirit. I'm a hustler, y'all. Have you heard? That was very big when I was in college in the late 90s, early 2000s, the 2010s. Being a girl boss, being a hustler was a very big thing. And I just felt very out of place because that was not in my spirit. To my wife's chagrin, I often do not associate my time and labor with wages, meaning my first instinct is to give them away, not to seek remuneration. I haven't paid bills in 16 years thanks to having a CFO. And I am incredibly thrifty, almost to a fault. I once put off replacing a ceiling fan in our bedroom for 3 years because I took it apart and I figured out which part had gone bad. And I knew which part to replace. I could fix it. I could fix it for a $7 part, y'all. And for 3 years, I did not replace that ceiling fan because I was so determined to replace that $7 part and make use of that ceiling fan. See, I actively tried not to need money, not to be in relationship, not to need it, not to be directly there with it. I do not offer you these insights to brag. I am not describing to you some type of piety or some way of righteous living. Please hear me when I say that not having a direct relationship with money, avoiding it, being fearful of it, is not something that I would recommend. And I don't think Jesus recommends it either. So what I offer you today is what has been offered to me from God. Some starting principles for a Christ follower's relationship with money. Just some really basic. I don't by any means think that these are all that the Bible or Jesus had to say about money or principles or teachings in any way. But if you're interested in even a little bit in developing a better relationship with money, a relationship that isn't built around fear or avoidance, perhaps these can be a starting point. So the first parable in Luke 16, you'll notice I did not read it, okay? In the first parable, that's because the first parable in Luke 16, verses 1 through 9, is a doozy. If you have read it, it is often called the parable of the dishonest manager. And everyone agrees on one thing about this parable, and that's that it's incredibly difficult to figure out what's going on. Is Jesus telling us to be dishonest? Are we supposed to be shrewd like the children of this age? Is Jesus really telling us to make friends by means of dishonest wealth? Why would he do that? Honestly, I don't know. I honestly don't know. God has not revealed to me the answers to those specific questions. But what has been revealed, what I have heard from God about this parable, is that it instructs us simply to be in relationship with money. At that very basic, to be in relationship with money. It's the relationship with money that's key. And I was avoiding that relationship. God said the love of money is the root of all evil. So what better way to avoid loving something, or so to not love something, than to avoid it? It's really hard to love and fall in love with a TV show that you've never watched. It's really almost impossible to fall in love with a person that you've never seen or talked to. And what I heard from God was that what you're doing, your avoidance, is a cop-out. And yes, God is that direct with me. It's a cop-out. And he said, I didn't tell you to not be in a relationship with it. I told you not to love it. And those are two different things. So why would Jesus instruct us to be in relationship with money? If it is indeed the root of all evil, why would God want us anywhere near it? I think it's tied to two things. First, Jesus recognizes that we are actively living in this world. And that he prayed in John 17:15, I am not asking you to take them out of the world, but I ask you to protect them from evil, when he was praying about his disciples. He instructs us to go out into all the world and preach the gospel. And being in the world, whether that is in first century Palestine or in our big C capitalist system today, means being in relationship with money. The second thing I think it's tied to is our instruction to build God's kingdom. It says specifically, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. This is the world that we are working with. We are instructed to build a kingdom of compassion and care and healing here in these circumstances, under these economic conditions, under big C capitalism. How can we expect to do that if we aren't in a healthy relationship with money? So what are some ways that we can build a healthier relationship with money? I think Jesus offers us some starting points, beginning in verse 10. Whoever is faithful in a very little is faithful also in much, and whoever is dishonest in a very little is dishonest also in much. If then you have not been faithful with the dishonest wealth, who will entrust you to the true riches? And if you have not been faithful with what belongs to another, who will give you what is your own? Now, I come from a background, and Ben may have warned you about this. I have a Pentecostal apostolic background, and that was sprinkled with what you might know as the prosperity gospel was sprinkled through all that. So my first instinct when I read these verses, if I'm being honest, is to read a prosperity message here. Has anyone else ever prayed the lottery prayer? I call it the lottery prayer. The lottery prayer of, Lord, I have been faithful with what you have given me, and I'm asking you to bless me with the Powerball, which I will also be very faithful with. Or you could flip this verse around and you could use that passage to judge others, right? You can say, oh, well, God's not blessing you. You must not be doing what's right with your money, whatever right is. But I want to pull way back to about 20,000 feet and see a different message here in these lines. The amount doesn't matter, and neither does the source. Your relationship with $5 or $500 or $5,000 is your relationship, meaning your values on whom, on what, where, why, how you spend your money. Those values are your values no matter how much you are spending, right? So when he says you'll be faithful in, you're faithful in much, or you will be faithful in little, you'll be faithful in much. If you're dishonest with little, you're dishonest with much. I think what we can read here in that underlying message is your values, your beliefs about money, your feelings about money, or your feelings about money. And those are going to follow you no matter how much money that is. Many of us, myself included, have felt the class divide lately and the struggle that is happening in our country. There is a strong temptation to create an us versus them that is centered on the having and the not having of money. And in this, what I believe is a false dichotomy, we have set this up so that the people who have money, them, are evil, and the people who don't have money, us, are good. And I'm not saying there's no evidence for this. I would have to be blind to tell you that there is no evidence for this. It's absolutely staggering and sometimes demoralizing what is going on in our world. That's why this temptation is so strong, because there's so much evidence for it. But I think what Jesus is inviting us to see here is that your values around money don't become relevant when you become a billionaire or a millionaire. They're relevant now with whatever it is that we have. We are responsible for bringing God's kingdom to earth here and now. So what we have here and now must be used to that end. Not when we get the promotion, not when the mortgage or the credit card is paid off. Are we being faithful to bringing God's kingdom to earth now? And then moving on to verses 13 and 15. No slave can serve two masters, for a slave will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. We've heard this one so many times, right? It's pretty famous. But there's another phrase that I want to ask if you've heard. Have you ever heard the phrase, get the bag? Okay, it is a popular phrase. It comes from, if you are robbing a bank, right? The idea is to get the bag of money. It has evolved over the past, I would say, 10, 15 years, maybe, to essentially mean getting the money, right? Wherever that money comes from, getting the money. And a lot of it is around the goal of life, the goal of the world is essentially to get the bag by any means necessary. Y'all, I hate that phrase. I really, really do. And I despise this phrase because I have heard it, or the underlying sentiment behind it, be used to justify or excuse what might otherwise be considered morally or ethically questionable behavior. So there's a guy, Trevor Noah, the comedian, if you're all familiar with him. He used to do The Daily Show. And Trevor Noah is one of those comedians that I really like, because I feel like in his comedy, he does social commentary, and he comments on our society in a way that I believe generally promotes a high and ethical moral standard, right? I generally agree with what he has to say and the way that he pushes us through his comedy, to be better people to one another and to treat one another better. I believe that that is his general ethos from what I've heard. I read his biography and loved it. I love his story and his perspective on the world. So you might have also heard that there was a comedy festival in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, last year, right? And many big comedians were invited to go. Trevor Noah, to my knowledge, was not one of them. But one of them who was invited to go was Dave Chappelle. And so as I was perusing YouTube one day, I saw a video, and it was Trevor Noah speaking on the fact that Dave Chappelle said yes and went to Riyadh. And I said, oh, okay, I want to see this. Because so many people, the common folk definitely had opinions about that, right? And the sentiment that I saw often, at least in my circles, and we have to admit those are particular circles, but the sentiment that I saw in my circles was, well, there's a line. It doesn't matter how much money they're offering you, you don't go. But what I was interested in seeing was whether or not this comedian, Trevor Noah, would actually hold his colleague, his fellow comedian, someone he considered a friend, hold his feet to the fire. Because I in my spirit, I really felt like I knew what Trevor Noah would say if he had been invited. But, you know, Chappelle agreed to go to Riyadh. And in this video, Trevor says, well, you know, at the end of the day, they paid him. He had to get the bag. And I said, oh, y'all, I was so disappointed. And I know I shouldn't be disappointed in celebrities. I know that. I know better than that. I know I shouldn't do that. But I was disappointed because I really wanted Trevor Noah to hold the line. I really wanted to see someone with his voice, with that much voice and that much input and influence in our society, hold that line and say, no, I think that was too far. I think that that was a bad idea. Now, I saw that video, and that video came out much closer to when the comedy festival actually happened. And it was before I had seen anything about Dave Chappelle commenting on the fact that he went to the comedy festival. But I happened to see a video today by accident, literally earlier this morning. And essentially what Dave Chappelle said was, I said no the first time that they invited me to go years ago, back in 2021. Because everyone knew what had happened in Riyadh and with the government of Saudi Arabia. But then I saw Netflix make a deal with Saudi Arabia. And I saw the United States government make a deal with Saudi Arabia. And I saw the golfers, and I saw the WWE. And eventually he said, well, if everybody else is doing it, must be good enough for me. So there's a couple different things here, right? And I think that they get into that idea of getting the bag and this idea of whether or not we can serve two masters. Because the problem that I have here is not so much with the Riyadh Comedy Festival or with Dave Chappelle, though I think that his reasoning is absolutely horrendous. Like I said, my problem was with Trevor Noah. My concern is that we as Christ followers, though I do not profess that he is a Christ follower, but we as those who are trying to uphold a moral and ethical standard in our own lives are not speaking up and pushing back and saying, no, there are some bags that simply aren't worth getting. And not just to the world, but to each other, to our faith leaders and in our faith spaces, to ourselves. When the world is willing to excuse and forgive itself for any decision, when money or income is on the line, we become tempted to do the same. I get it, y'all. I really do. If everyone else is doing it, why not me? And especially when we're usually doing it for a much smaller bag. But what we must remember is that we don't serve the master the world serves. Money is indeed the master of this world, so it makes sense that that the world will excuse any moral or ethical question as long as it is in pursuit of money. And I can know that it can feel like tilting at windmills to suggest that people behave otherwise. But I believe that this is what we are called to do. We are to remind people that there is another way There can be something more meaningful and more powerful to strive for than more money. We are called to model the behavior of placing love, not of money, but of God and God's people at the center of our decision making about money, and to expect that from others who profess to serve our God. And finally, we get to verse 18. Now, this is a doozy, y'all. This one comes out of absolutely nowhere. It is the verse about divorce. Anyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery, and whoever marries a woman divorced from her husband commits adultery. Again, the fun of Luke 16. Here we are talking about money, and then suddenly there's this verse about a divorce and adultery. Again, thank goodness for these commentaries and Bible scholars, because when you dig in, I think there is a lesson here about money as well. So let's contextualize this a bit. First century, and now, mind you, again, I did not go to seminary. Ben is going to fact check me on all of this, but I did use at least 3 sources. First century Jews were living under Roman occupation when this was spoken by Jesus, but continuing to follow Jewish law whenever possible, including when it came to marriage. And under that law, only a man could initiate a divorce from his wife. Now, some sects of Judaism they were splitting on this issue of divorce and when a divorce was actually allowable, under what circumstances. Specifically, under a Hillel interpretation, divorce could be for nearly any reason, even trivial ones, like the fact that I didn't make my wife dinner tonight, right? That would be one of those reasons. And when that happened, the result was a poor, marginalized woman with no means of supporting herself. Now, so what does this have to do with money? When you look back at the verse, we see no reference in here to money. The divorce did not happen because of money. From what we can read in the scripture, it seems like the purpose of the divorce was to marry another woman. So where does the money come in? I think what we should see here is the irresponsible and damaging way in which first century Jewish men were wielding their power and privilege. When they utilized their legal power and their social privilege to divorce their wives, which was their right under that Hillel interpretation, they created the very people God's kingdom is trying to save. They created poor, marginalized women. So one of the lessons I think we can take from this verse is a reminder to use our power and privilege responsibly, particularly when that power and privilege can create or remove financial oppression for others. And again, I'm not talking to the billionaires and millionaires in the room. I'm talking to myself. I'm talking to the voters, the taxpayers, the managers, the hiring directors, the union reps, the board members, the commissioners. I'm talking about the power and privilege that we each hold in our daily lives, as little or as great as it is. I know it often doesn't seem like very much at all, but it is there. And we must remember to use that power and privilege in a way that serves God, not in a way that creates more people for God's kingdom to save. Whew. Y'all, money is a tough subject, and literally just skimming the surface here on these verses. But it's complicated and nuanced, and all of us feel differently about it. But we can't avoid it. We can't fear it. We can't ignore it. Not in a country with this growing rate of wealth inequality that hasn't been seen since the Roaring 20s, or in a country where there appears to be a ruling oligarchy that seeks to control not just our government, but also our news and media and land and data. It is incredibly tempting to draw a bright line in the sand that says too much money equals a bad person, then smudge that line when it becomes morally or socially convenient. Money is tough. So I'm so thankful that Jesus offers us these guideposts. I'm so thankful that God has offered me these very simple guideposts. First, we must be in relationship with money, acknowledging that it is the master of this world, and therefore doing kingdom work like caring and comforting and healing is going to need it. Second, the amount doesn't matter. Your money values are your money values. We have to live them no matter how much we're working with. Third, we must serve God, not money. by putting God at the center of our decision making and being in pursuit of God's kingdom, not the bag. And finally, we must wield our power and privilege responsibly, not in a way that financially burdens or oppresses others. And that is the message that God has given me for you. And I thank you for the opportunity to offer it this evening. Thank you.